Her parents kicked her out for being infertile, until the mountain man said, "She's mine now." The sun burns hot on a dusty main street as a young woman is thrown into the dirt, her own family shutting the door forever. The crowd whispers, church bells toll, and she clutches nothing but a worn Bible. Alone, shamed, unwanted. But then, boots strike the dust. A giant of the mountain steps forward, lays down his rifle, and claims her before them all. His words echo through the silence. She's mine now. Yet safety is short-lived. Behind closed doors, a brother plots to take her away. Not for love, but for profit. Flames rise against the night. A cabin burns, and a secret deed, long forgotten, may be the only thing standing between freedom and ruin. What happens when a woman cast aside by blood is chosen by honor instead? Can love born in ashes withstand greed, fire, and betrayal? Or will she be torn away once more? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late spring sun cast long shadows across the Colorado grasslands as Miriam Callahan guided the cattle toward home. Her mare's steady gait and the rhythmic jingling of spurs brought a measure of peace after a long day of riding fence lines. The familiar scent of sage and prairie grass filled the cooling evening air. "Come along now," she called softly to the stragglers, her voice carrying on the breeze. The herd moved steadily, their backs golden in the setting sun. This was her favorite time of day, when the world felt vast yet somehow intimate, like being wrapped in God's own blanket. As she approached the ranch house, smoke curled from the chimney into the darkening sky. The aroma of her mother's cooking usually welcomed her home, but tonight something felt different. The windows glowed with lamplight, yet the usual warmth seemed absent. Miriam dismounted and led her horse to the barn, taking care with the evening routine she'd followed since childhood. Brush down the mare, check her hooves, ensure fresh water and hay. The familiar tasks steadied her hands, though her heart held an unnamed worry. The screen door creaked as she entered the house. Her boots echoed on the wooden floor, sounds that had always meant home, but tonight felt hollow. "You're late," her mother said without turning from the stove. The words fell flat in the kitchen. "I'm sorry, Ma. The fence near Miller's Creek needed mending." Miriam moved to wash her hands at the pump sink. "Would you like help with supper?" "Set the table." Her mother's voice was tight, controlled. Miriam gathered plates and utensils, the silverware clicking against the worn tablecloth. Her father sat in his chair, reading the newspaper with unusual intensity. The silence pressed in around them like a gathering storm. They sat down to eat, the scrape of chairs harsh in the quiet kitchen. Steam rose from bowls of stew and fresh-baked bread, but the familiar comfort of the family meal was absent. Miriam's stomach clenched as she folded her hands for grace. Her father's prayer was shorter than usual, clipped and mechanical. They began eating, the clink of spoons the only sound, until her mother set down her utensils with deliberate care. "Dr. Matthews spoke to me in town today." Miriam's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. The bite of stew suddenly tasted like ashes. "He shared his findings from your examination last month." Her mother's voice was flat, emotionless. "Said he thought we should know." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer. Miriam carefully set down her spoon, her hands trembling slightly. I haven't received his report yet." "He says you can't have children." The words fell like stones. "Ever." Miriam's chest tightened. She'd suspected, had carried the fear like a shadow, but hearing it spoken aloud made it devastatingly real. There might be other doctors, other opinions. Her father's fist crashed onto the table, making the dishes jump. What use is a woman who can't bear children? His voice rose like thunder. Who'll want you now? What family will you ever have? I can still work the ranch, Miriam whispered. I'm strong. I know the land. The land needs sons. Her father stood, his chair scraping back. Needs generations to work it, to keep it in the family. You're useless for a family. Tears burned in Miriam's eyes, but she fought them back. Please, Pa, don't call me that. His words cut like a knife. No daughter of mine is barren. Pack your things. You're not sleeping under this roof tonight. Miriam looked to her mother, seeking any softness, any defense. But her mother's face was stone, eyes fixed on her cooling stew. The silence was answer enough. She rose on shaking legs and climbed the stairs to her room. Each step felt like climbing a mountain. The familiar space, her sanctuary since childhood, now seemed foreign, hostile. With numb fingers, she began folding clothes into her trunk, each item a memory she'd never live again. Her grandmother's Bible lay on the bedside table, its leather worn smooth by generations of hands. Miriam clutched it to her chest, seeking comfort in its solid presence. Verses of comfort fluttered through her mind, but grief drowned out their solace. Sleep never came. She sat on her bed through the long night hours, watching darkness fade to gray dawn through her window. The first rooster had barely crowed when heavy footsteps approached her door. Time to go. Her father's voice was cold. Miriam followed him down the stairs, her trunk scraping each step. Her mother wasn't there to say goodbye. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they loaded the trunk into the wagon. The ride into town stretched endless and silent. Miriam clutched her grandmother's Bible, its familiar weight the only anchor in a world suddenly unmoored. Each bump and rattle of the wagon wheels marked another step away from everything she'd known. Main Street was just coming alive as they arrived. Shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, workers headed to the livery and smithy. The wagon's sudden stop drew curious eyes. With brutal efficiency, her father heaved her trunk over the side. It landed with a crash in the street's dust, the sound echoing between the buildings. Miriam climbed down slowly, dignity the only shield she had left. Pa, please, she tried one last time. But the wagon was already moving, her father's back rigid as he drove away without a backward glance. Miriam stood alone in the growing crowd, their whispers rising like wind through prairie grass. Poor thing, someone murmured. Cast out like that? Well, if she can't bear children, another voice answered. What else could they do? Shame on them, a third person hissed. Their own daughter. Miriam's cheeks burned, but she held her head high. Clutching her grandmother's Bible closer, she forced herself to breathe slowly, steadily. The morning sun caught the gold lettering on the Bible's cover, a glint of light in the darkness of this moment. The crowd's attention felt like brands on her skin. Some faces held pity, others judgment. A few looked away, unwilling to witness such a public shame. Miriam stood still, letting the waves of whispers wash over her, anchored only by the solid weight of Scripture in her hands. She was alone now, cut off from everything familiar, everything safe. But somewhere in the depths of her soul, beneath the crushing weight of rejection, a tiny spark of strength flickered. God had not abandoned her, even if her family had. The Bible in her hands held promises that went deeper than blood ties, spoke of a love that couldn't be lost through barrenness. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the dusty street. Miriam's shadow stretched before her, a solitary figure in a world suddenly vast and unknown. The whispers continued, the stares lingered, but she remained standing. Sometimes, she realized, courage looked like simply refusing to crumble when the world fell apart. The stunned silence stretched across Main Street like a drawn bowstring. Miriam stood beside her trunk, her grandmother's Bible pressed close, feeling the weight of every stare. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and somewhere in the distance, a shop bell tinkled. Movement at the edge of the crowd drew eyes away from Miriam. A tall figure emerged from the shadows of the general store's porch, his presence commanding immediate attention. Michael Grant stood head and shoulders above most men in town, his frame broad and solid from years of working the high country. A long scar traced his jaw, disappearing into his dark beard, and his eyes held the keen watchfulness of a man used to reading wilderness signs. He moved with the deliberate grace of a mountain lion, setting his rifle carefully against a hitching post. His boots left clear prints in the dust. As he crossed the street, each step measured and purposeful. The crowd parted before him like water around a stone. Miriam had seen him before, trading furs in town or loading supplies at the general store, but always from a distance. Up close, she could see the weather-worn creases around his eyes, the way his hands, though massive, moved with surprising gentleness as he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "She's mine now," he declared, his voice deep and steady as a mountain stream. The words fell into the morning quiet like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathered onlookers. Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, pressed a hand to her throat. "Mr. Grant, surely you don't mean— I mean exactly what I said." His tone held no room for argument. He turned to his wagon, already loaded with supplies for his return to the high country. With efficient movements, he lifted Miriam's trunk as if it weighed nothing, securing it alongside sacks of flour and coffee. Miriam stood frozen, her mind struggling to make sense of this sudden turn. The Bible trembled slightly in her hands as she watched this stranger claim her with such certainty. Yet what choice did she have? The street's dust still held the fresh tracks of her father's wagon, leading away from her forever. Michael Grant turned back to her, his expression gentle despite his fierce appearance. He offered his hand, calloused and strong, waiting for her decision. The crowd held its collective breath. Miriam glanced around at the familiar faces of townspeople she'd known all her life. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched with poorly hidden curiosity. None stepped forward to offer another solution. Drawing a deep breath, Miriam placed her hand in Michael's. His fingers closed carefully around hers as he helped her up to the wagon seat. The leather creaked beneath her as she settled, clutching her grandmother's Bible like an anchor in this storm of change. Michael gathered the reins and clicked softly to his team. The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking as they turned toward the mountain trail. Miriam didn't look back at the town, but she could feel the stares following them until they rounded the bend past the livery stable. The morning stretched on as they traveled, the wagon climbing steadily into higher country. Aspen leaves flickered silver-green overhead, and the air grew cooler with each mile. Miriam sat straight, trying to still the trembling in her hands, acute awareness of the stranger beside her making her throat tight with unspoken questions. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper, the word barely louder than the creak of wagon wheels. Michael kept his eyes on the trail ahead, guiding the horses around a fallen log with careful attention. "No one deserves to be cast out," he said simply, as if those 6 words explained everything. They continued in silence, the wagon swaying gently as it followed the winding trail. Miriam watched the familiar, valley fall away below them, replaced by steeper slopes and denser forest. The sun climbed higher, filtering through pine branches in sharp shafts of light. It was late afternoon when they crested a final ridge, and Michael's cabin came into view. It stood in a small clearing, solid and well-maintained, with a tin roof that caught the sunlight. A neat stack of firewood lined one wall, and a small garden plot showed signs of recent tending. Michael drew the wagon to a stop near the cabin's door. "It ain't much," he said quietly, "but it's dry and warm." He helped her down from the wagon seat, then began unloading their supplies with practiced efficiency. Miriam stood uncertain, taking in what was to be her new home. The cabin's windows were clean, smoke curled from the stone chimney, and mountain wildflowers nodded in the breeze near the door. It spoke of care, if not luxury. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Michael carried her trunk inside. Miriam followed, pausing in the doorway to let her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The cabin's interior was simple but orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting warm light on the plank floor. A few pieces of sturdy furniture filled the main room. A table with chairs, a rocking chair near the hearth, shelves holding books and tools. Michael moved to a small door off the main room, opening it to reveal a tiny but neat chamber. "This was Sarah's room," he said softly, setting down Miriam's trunk. "My wife's. She's been gone 3 years now. Fever took her and our little one." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss. Miriam looked around the small room, noting the carefully swept floor, the clean curtains at the window, the simple bed with its patchwork quilt. Someone had loved this space once. "You'll be safe here," Michael continued, his voice gruff but kind. "I'll bed down by the fire." He turned to go, then paused. "There's soup warming on the hearth when you're hungry." Left alone in the small room, Miriam sank onto the bed, her grandmother's Bible still clutched to her chest. Through the window she could see the last rays of sunlight painting the mountain peaks gold. The sound of Michael moving about the main room, banking the fire and setting out bowls, drifted through the thin walls. She ran her fingers over the Bible's worn cover, tracing the familiar patterns in its leather. This morning, she had woken in her childhood home, secure in her place in the world. Now, as evening settled over the mountain, she sat in a stranger's cabin. Everything she knew stripped away except her faith, and the unexpected kindness of a scarred mountain man. The quiet of the high country wrapped around the cabin like a blanket, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a nighthawk. In this moment of pause between what was and what would be, Miriam closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for shelter, no matter how strange its source. Through her window, the first stars began to appear above the timberline, bright and clear in the mountain air. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for tonight she was safe, protected by the strength of a man who understood what it meant to be alone. Morning light crept through the gaps between the cabin logs, painting thin golden lines across Miriam's small room. She had woken before dawn, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain. Wind in the pines, birds she couldn't name, the distant cry of what might have been a wolf. The bed felt strange, though the quilt was soft with age and use. Rising quietly, she smoothed her wrinkled dress and tidied her hair. Through the thin wall, she could hear Michael moving about outside, the steady thud of an axe splitting wood. Her stomach twisted with uncertainty, but she squared her shoulders. If this was to be her home now, she would make herself useful. The main room was cool, the fire burned down to embers. Miriam added small sticks, nursing the flames back to life as her mother had taught her. The thought brought a sharp pang, but she pushed it aside. On the rough-hewn shelves, she found basic provisions: flour, salt, coffee beans, a jar of honey. Not much, but enough to work with. She located an iron skillet and mixing bowl, moving carefully to avoid making noise. The water bucket by the door was full. Michael must have brought it in early. Using practiced movements, she mixed a batch of biscuit dough, the familiar task steadying her hands. The coffee pot proved more challenging. At home, they'd had a proper stove with a flat top. Here, she had to adjust to cooking over the open hearth, learning how to balance the pot on the iron hooks that swung out over the flames. The rich scent of coffee soon filled the cabin, mingling with the promise of fresh bread. When Michael stepped through the door, arms loaded with split wood, he stopped short. Miriam tensed, suddenly unsure of her presumption in using his supplies, but his expression, though surprised, held no anger. "You didn't have to," he said, setting the wood carefully in the box beside the hearth. "I wanted to make myself useful," Miriam replied softly, sliding the golden brown biscuits onto a plate. "There's coffee too if you'd like some." He nodded, washing his hands in the basin by the door before settling at the table. Miriam served him with trembling fingers, then stood uncertainly until he gestured to the other chair. "Sit. Eat." The meal passed in silence, broken only by the crack and pop of the fire. Michael ate steadily, finishing 3 biscuits with honey before pushing back from the table. "Thank you," he said simply, then headed back outside where more work awaited. Days began to flow one into another, marked by the rhythm of necessary tasks. Miriam learned the peculiarities of the cabin, which floorboards creaked, how to bank the fire just right for the night, where the roof leaked during afternoon thunderstorms. She kept the water bucket full, swept the plank floors, and mended tears in Michael's work shirts when she found them. Michael seemed to accept her presence without comment, going about his daily routines of hunting, trapping, and maintaining the cabin. They shared meals in what slowly became a more comfortable silence, no longer weighted with the awkwardness of strangers forced together. One evening, as she was organizing the shelves, Miriam discovered a Bible tucked behind a stack of old newspapers. Unlike her grandmother's well-worn volume, this one was covered in dust, its pages undisturbed for what must have been years. She glanced at Michael, who sat in his usual place by the fire, whittling a piece of pine. Taking a deep breath, she settled into the rocking chair and opened the Bible. The leather was still supple beneath its coating of dust, the pages crisp despite their long neglect. In a voice that gained strength as she continued, she began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want—" Michael's hands stilled on his carving, but he didn't look up. Miriam continued, letting the familiar words fill the cabin. When she finished the psalm, silence settled over them again, but it felt different, like the quiet after rain rather than before a storm. The next evening, she read again. This time, Michael set aside his work entirely, leaning back in his chair with eyes closed as she shared passages of comfort and hope. It became their pattern. After the day's work was done and supper cleared away, Miriam would read while Michael listened. One night, as she closed the Bible, Michael spoke quietly. "Sarah used to read those same words." He stared into the fire, his face shadowed. "She'd read to little James, too, even though he was too young to understand." Miriam's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "The fever?" she asked softly. He nodded. 3 days. Nothing we could do." His large hands gripped the arms of his chair. "I couldn't protect them." Miriam thought of her own shame, the doctor's words that had stripped away her future. "Sometimes," she said carefully, What breaks us isn't our fault." Michael looked at her then, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since bringing her to his home. Understanding passed between them. Two people marked by loss, finding unexpected shelter in each other's presence. The days grew warmer as spring settled fully into the mountains. Miriam began tending the small garden plot, coaxing new life from the soil. She hung washing on the line strung between pines, the white sheets snapping in the mountain wind. The simple tasks brought a quiet dignity to her days, so different from the shame that had driven her from her family's home. Each morning she woke to the sound of Michael chopping wood or checking his trap lines. Each evening, they shared simple meals and the comfort of scripture. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but in the growing peace of their daily routine, Miriam found something she hadn't expected: safety. She watched Michael sometimes, when he didn't notice, saw how he paused to watch sunsets paint the mountains gold, or stopped to help a fallen bird back to its nest. His hands might be scarred and rough, but they moved with gentle care when the moment called for it. Like the mountain itself, he had depths beneath his weathered surface. Their lives settled into a pattern as natural as the rhythm of the seasons. Morning light through log cracks, the smell of coffee and bread, the crunch of boots on pine needles. Evening shadows growing long, fire crackling in the hearth, ancient words of faith bridging the space between two wounded souls. In these quiet moments, as spring bloomed on the mountainside, Miriam felt the first stirrings of hope. Not the desperate wish for children that had haunted her before, but something different. A sense that perhaps worth could be measured in more ways than one, and that healing might come in unexpected forms. A week passed in the gentle rhythm they had established. The morning dawned clear, with songbirds trilling their welcome to the sun. Miriam stood at the wash basin, hands deep in sudsy water as she scrubbed Michael's work shirts. The sound of approaching horses made her pause, water dripping from her fingers. 3 riders appeared through the trees, following the narrow trail that led to the cabin. Michael emerged from the barn, his stance wary as he watched them approach. Miriam recognized the man in front from glimpses in town. Caleb Grant, Michael's younger brother. Where Michael was solid and weathered like an old oak, Caleb had the sleek look of a man who preferred parlors to mountain paths. 2 rough-looking cowhands flanked him, their expressions hard beneath their hat brims. "Well, well," Caleb called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Seems the rumors are true. The hermit's taken in a stray." His voice carried a mocking edge that made Miriam's shoulders tense. Michael moved to stand between the riders and the cabin. "State your business, Caleb." Caleb swung down from his saddle, boots raising small clouds of dust. He looked past his brother to where Miriam stood frozen in the doorway, his gaze crawling over her like something unclean. "Just checking on my big brother's welfare. Town's buzzing about your charitable act." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Taking in damaged goods like that." Miriam flinched at the words, her hands clutching the doorframe. Michael's back stiffened, but he kept his voice level. "She's under my protection now. That's all you need to know." "Protection?" Caleb laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Without legal standing? Without proper papers?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You know as well as I do that an unmarried woman with no family backing can be subject to arrangement. Marriage contracts have settled many a frontier debt." The threat in his words made Miriam's blood run cold. She remembered stories whispered around town about women bartered away to cover gambling losses or failed ventures. Her legs trembled beneath her skirts. I've got some associates who might be interested in such an arrangement, Caleb continued, watching Miriam's face pale. Could be worth quite a bit to the right buyer, even considering her condition. Michael moved with the speed of a striking mountain cat. In 2 strides, he closed the distance to his brother, his large hands fisting in Caleb's fancy vest. "She's under my roof," he growled, voice low and dangerous. "My protection. You come threatening what's mine, you'll answer to more than just the law." The cowhands shifted nervously in their saddles, hands straying toward their gun belts, but Caleb waved them off. He straightened his vest when Michael released him, trying to maintain his composure. "The law's the law, brother. Papers and contracts mean something out here. You can't just claim a woman like a stray horse." "Some things mean more than paper," Michael replied. "Honor, loyalty, protection of those who need it. Those are older laws than anything written in your books." Caleb's face darkened. "We'll see about that." He swung back into his saddle, gathering his reins. "I'll be back, with proper authority. Then we'll see what your mountain man's honor is worth." He wheeled his horse around, the cowhands falling in behind him. "Better warn your little housekeep to pack light." They rode away, hoofbeats fading into the forest. Miriam sagged against the doorframe, her legs weak with fear. Michael strode to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "He can't really," she whispered, unable to finish the thought. Michael guided her gently to sit in her rocking chair, kneeling before her. "Listen to me," he said, his rough hands covering hers. "What I said out there wasn't just words. You're under my protection now. Frontier justice isn't always about what's written in books. It's about standing by your word, protecting those who trust you." His eyes held hers, steady and sure. "I won't let him harm you." "But he said, the law." "The law out here is what men make of it," Michael said. "And there are more men in these mountains who'd stand with honor than would side with schemes and threats." He squeezed her hands gently. "You're safe here. I promise you that." Miriam drew a shaking breath, trying to steady herself. The morning's peace felt shattered, like the surface of a calm pond broken by a thrown stone. But Michael's presence anchored her, his quiet strength offering shelter from the storm of Caleb's threats. She looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers small and work-reddened. Different paths had brought them here, but somehow they had found something worth protecting in each other's company. The thought gave her courage. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing up for me. No one's done that before." Michael's expression softened. "No one should have had to. Your worth isn't measured by what others say about you." He stood, moving to stoke the fire that had burned low. Caleb's always thought everything could be bought or sold. He never understood that some things, honor, faith, loyalty, can't be written in contracts. Miriam watched him work, his movements sure and purposeful. She thought of how he had claimed her that day in town, how he had given her shelter without asking anything in return. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps there were laws older and truer than those written by men. The rest of the day passed in a haze of worry, but Michael stayed close to the cabin, his presence a comfort. As evening settled over the mountains, Miriam took up her grandmother's Bible, finding solace in its familiar words. Michael listened as she read, his face thoughtful in the firelight. When she finished, he spoke quietly. "We'll need to be ready. Caleb won't give up easily when he sets his mind to something." "What can we do?" Miriam asked, her voice small against the gathering darkness. "For now, we stay alert. I've got friends in these mountains, men who know the difference between paper law and true justice." He looked at her steadily. "Do you trust me?" Miriam thought of all the small kindnesses he had shown her, the quiet strength that had become her shelter. "Yes," she said simply. "I trust you." Michael nodded, satisfied. "Then rest easy tonight. Whatever comes, you're not alone anymore." The fire crackled softly between them, its light holding back the shadows that pressed against the cabin walls. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its voice carrying across the mountainside. Miriam felt the weight of Caleb's threats still pressing on her heart, but alongside it was something else. The steadying knowledge that here, in this rough cabin with this quiet man, she had found something worth fighting for. The summer sun climbed higher each day, stretching golden hours across the mountainside like honey dripping slow. Miriam stood in the patch of earth she'd claimed for a garden, wiping sweat from her brow as she surveyed her work. The soil here was rocky, but she'd spent days picking stones and working in the few handfuls of stable manure Michael had helped her gather. Now, neat rows of seedlings pushed through the dark earth, beans, carrots, and hardy greens that could weather the mountain's short growing season. She'd even managed to coax a few tomato plants to take root against the cabin's sun-warmed logs, protected from late frosts by old blankets on cold nights. The garden wasn't just about food, though Michael's appreciative nods at fresh vegetables in their suppers made her chest warm with pride. It was about putting down roots, making this place feel more like home. Each morning she touched the tender leaves, checking their progress like counting blessings. Inside the cabin, a pile of Michael's worn shirts waited for her attention. She'd noticed him trying to hide the frayed cuffs and torn seams, too proud or too unused to asking for help. But she'd seen, and now she worked on them in the evenings, her needle flashing in the firelight while he listened to her read from her grandmother's Bible. "You don't have to mend those," he'd said the first time, looking uncomfortable. "I want to," she'd replied simply, and that had been that. It was a small way to repay his kindness, to show her worth went beyond what her father had declared. The sound of limping hoofbeats drew her attention. Michael led a sorry-looking foal toward the barn, its right foreleg held gingerly off the ground. The poor creature's coat was matted, its ribs showing through like barrel staves. "Found him caught in wire down by the creek," Michael explained as Miriam hurried over. "Mother must have been taken by wolves." Together they worked to gentle the frightened animal. Miriam's soft voice and patient hands helped calm it while Michael examined the leg. The wound wasn't deep, but infection had set in. For the next week, Miriam spent hours in the barn, cleaning the cut with boiled water and herbs, coaxing the foal to eat mashed grain from her palm. "You've got away with hurt things," Michael observed one evening, watching her change the bandage. She looked up, caught by the quiet understanding in his eyes. They both knew he wasn't just talking about the foal. "Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to see past the broken parts," she said softly. Their days fell into comfortable rhythms. During morning chores, Michael would sometimes share stories of learning to trap with his father, his voice growing warm with memory. Miriam found herself opening up, too, telling him about summer evenings spent reading Psalms with her grandmother, the old woman's gnarled fingers tracing the beloved words. "The Lord is my shepherd," Miriam quoted one day while picking beans. "I shall not want." "My mother loved that one," Michael said, surprising her. He rarely spoke of his late wife and child, but lately the pain in his eyes when he did seemed less raw, more like an old scar that had finally healed clean. When Saturday came, they hitched the wagon for their monthly trip to town for supplies. Miriam felt her stomach tighten as they approached the bustling market square. The last time she'd been here, her father had thrown her trunk into the dust. But Michael's solid presence beside her helped steady her nerves. The whispers started as soon as they stepped down from the wagon. Women huddled in doorways, heads bent together. Men paused in their conversations to watch them pass. "Living in sin, mark my words," one sharp voice carried clearly. "Ain't natural. A man and woman unwed under one roof," another agreed. But there were other whispers too, curious rather than cruel. "He's changed since she came," an old-timer observed to his companion. "Less wild-like, more settled." "She's flourishing up there," a woman remarked. "Got some color back in her. Cheeks." Miriam kept her head high, though her cheeks burned. She focused on their errands: flour, coffee, salt, a few precious sugar candies Michael insisted on buying her. At the mercantile, she carefully selected sturdy thread for mending and seeds for late summer planting. As they loaded their purchases, Reverend Hayes approached them. The elderly preacher had always been kind to Miriam, even after her father's rejection. Now he shook Michael's hand warmly. "Good to see you coming down more regular," he said, his wise eyes taking in how Michael stood protectively near Miriam. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing healing to wounded hearts." "Reckon he does," Michael agreed quietly. The Reverend's words seemed to carry weight with the townsfolk. Miriam noticed some of the harder stares softening, a few friendly nods coming their way. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery even pressed a fresh loaf of bread into Miriam's hands with a motherly smile. "For your Sunday dinner," she said, patting Miriam's arm. "You're looking well, child." The ride home was peaceful, the wagon loaded with supplies and something less tangible but just as precious. A sense of acceptance beginning to bloom like Miriam's garden plants, pushing through rocky soil. The threat of Caleb still lingered, a shadow at the edges of their contentment. But it seemed less powerful in the face of their growing connection and the community's shifting attitude. As they crested the last rise before the cabin, the setting sun painted the mountains gold. Miriam glanced at Michael's strong profile, remembering how he'd stepped forward that desperate day to claim her. She hadn't known then that he was offering more than just shelter. He was giving her a chance to build something new, to prove her worth wasn't measured by what she couldn't do, but by what she could. The foal nickered a greeting as they approached, its leg almost healed now. Miriam's garden stretched green and promising beside the cabin. Inside, her mending waited by the rocking chair, and Michael's mother's Bible sat well-worn and loved on the shelf beside her grandmother's. "Home," Michael said simply as he helped her down from the wagon. "Yes," Miriam agreed, and meant it with all her heart. The evening shadows stretched long across the cabin floor as Miriam stirred the stew pot hanging over the fire. Summer thunderheads had rolled in that afternoon, bringing with them the sharp scent of rain and the low rumble of distant thunder. Michael sat in his usual chair, watching the flames dance while she read from her grandmother's Bible. Her voice carried steady and clear through the cabin. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Lightning flashed outside, illuminating Michael's face for a brief moment. In that instant, Miriam caught something raw in his expression, a pain usually hidden beneath his stoic exterior. "I used to know every word of that psalm," he said quietly, surprising her with the admission. "Sarah, my wife, she'd read it during storms." He paused, his rough hands clasped tight. "Haven't opened a Bible since the fever took them." Miriam set the book down carefully in her lap. "Your wife and child?" He nodded, still staring into the flames. "Little James was only 4. The fever came so fast. Nothing I could do except watch them slip away." His voice grew hoarse. "Prayed harder than I ever had. But they died anyway. Figured God wasn't listening, so I stopped talking to him." Rain began to patter against the roof, a gentle counterpoint to the weight of his words. Miriam's heart ached for the grief etched in every line of his face. "I reckon sometimes God's answer isn't what we want to hear," she said softly. "When my parents cast me out, I felt abandoned by everyone. Them, God, the whole world. But then you stepped forward that day." She met his eyes. Maybe God was listening after all, just answering different than I expected. Michael shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Wasn't nothing special, just did what needed doing." "It was special to me," Miriam insisted. She rose and crossed to the shelf where Michael's own Bible lay, gathering dust. Bringing it to him, she pressed it gently into his calloused hands. "Maybe it's time to start talking to him again." Michael stared down at the worn leather cover, his thumb tracing the faded gilt letters. "Wouldn't know where to begin." "Begin with truth," Miriam suggested. "He already knows what's in your heart anyway." For a long moment, only the sound of rain and crackling fire filled the cabin. Then, slowly, Michael bowed his head. His words came hesitant at first, rusty with disuse. "Lord, it's been a while." He swallowed hard. "I'm still angry about Sarah and James. Still don't understand why, but—" His voice strengthened slightly. "But thank you for sending Miriam, for giving me a reason to—" He trailed off, unable to continue. Miriam's own eyes filled with tears as she watched this strong, silent man struggle to reconnect with his faith. She reached across and laid her hand over his, where it gripped the Bible. Together they sat in the lamplight, letting the peace of shared prayer wash over them. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, but dark clouds of a different sort were gathering in town. Word reached them through Mrs. Peterson's son, who rode up to deliver a warning while making his regular milk deliveries to the mountain households. "There's a fancy lawyer from Denver asking questions," the boy reported, twisting his cap in his hands. "All dressed up in a suit, staying at the hotel. He's been talking to folks about Miss Miriam." Michael's face hardened. "Caleb's work?" The boy nodded. "Says he's looking into old contracts and such. Been over to the county office, going through deed books." After the boy left, Miriam's hands shook so badly she dropped a plate while washing up. Breakfast dishes. The crash of breaking crockery seemed to release something inside her, and she sank to her knees, tears flowing freely. Michael was at her side in an instant, strong arms helping her to a chair. "What is it?" "The contracts," she managed between sobs. "Papa made me sign papers before I turned 18. Said it was about protecting the ranch, making sure everything stayed in the family name." She pressed her hands to her face. "I didn't understand all the legal words, but I remember something about inheritance rights being dependent on bearing children to carry on the family line." Michael's jaw clenched. "Your father planned this?" "He must have known." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "The doctor must have told him I couldn't, that I was barren. He made sure I couldn't claim anything, not even my mother's jewelry or grandmother's quilts." Her voice broke. "Everything I grew up with, everything I loved, it's all lost to me now." "Listen to me," Michael said firmly, kneeling before her chair. He took her trembling hands in his. "A person's worth isn't measured by what their body can or can't do. It's not counted in deeds or dollars or fancy papers." "But the ranch is just land and buildings," he cut in. "Your father's ranch might be barred to you, but you've made this place bloom." He gestured to the window, where her garden flourished in the morning sun. "You've brought life here in 100 different ways. The foal you nursed, the bread you bake, the mending you do, those things matter more than any contract." Miriam hiccuped a small laugh through her tears. "You sound like a preacher. Sound like a man who's learning to see clearly again," he corrected gently. Maybe for the first time since Sarah died. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. You showed me that broken things can heal, Miriam. That new life can grow in the most unlikely places. She caught his rough hand against her face, drawing comfort from his strength. What are we going to do about Caleb and his lawyer? Face them together, Michael said simply. With God's help. The words surprised them both. It was the first time he'd spoken of God so naturally since his prayer the night before. Miriam saw something like wonder cross his face, as though he too was realizing how much had changed. Thunder rolled again in the distance, heralding another summer storm moving in across the mountains. But inside the cabin, as Miriam and Michael gathered the broken pieces of the plate together, there was a sense of peace despite the growing threats. They had each other, they had faith slowly rekindling, and they had the truth of who they were beyond any legal document's power to define. Later that evening, as the rain returned to drum against the roof, they sat together reading from both Bibles, his and hers, their voices joining in ancient words of comfort and hope. Outside, Caleb's schemes might be taking shape in a Denver lawyer's briefcase. But here in the lamplight, something stronger was building, a foundation of trust and faith that no contract could break. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the summer sun already warming the mountainside. Miriam stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting her best dress, one of the few items she'd managed to bring from her old life. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned her hair. Michael's heavy boots echoed on the wooden floor outside her door. "Wagon's ready whenever you are," he called softly. Miriam took a deep breath, steadying herself. This would be her first time at the church since that terrible day her father had cast her out. She'd avoided going, fearing the stares and whispers, but Michael had suggested it was time. When she emerged, she found Michael waiting by the door, dressed in his cleanest shirt, his usually wild beard neatly trimmed. He'd even polished his boots. The sight of his effort brought a warm smile to her face. "You look right proper," she said, smoothing his collar. A hint of color touched his cheeks. "Reckon a man ought to look his best in the Lord's house." He offered his arm. "Ready?" The wagon ride to town was quiet, both lost in their thoughts as the wheels creaked along the familiar trail. As they approached the white clapboard church, Miriam's grip tightened on the Bible in her lap, her grandmother's Bible, her one true inheritance. The bell was still ringing as Michael helped her down from the wagon. Already she could feel eyes upon them. Mrs. Peterson and her daughters paused on the steps, their Sunday bonnets bobbing as they whispered behind gloved hands. Old Mr. Jenkins, the hardware store owner, studied them openly from his usual spot by the hitching post. But Michael's steady presence beside her gave her courage. He didn't hurry or hesitate, just walked at her pace up the wooden steps. At the door, he removed his hat, and they stepped into the cool shadows of the church interior together. The murmurs rose immediately. Miriam could hear her name whispered, mixed with Michael's, as heads turned to watch their progress. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her chin up, following Michael's lead as he chose a pew about halfway down. As they settled into the smooth wooden bench, Miriam noticed something surprising. Not all the whispers seemed unkind. Mrs. Miller, whose husband had been helped by Michael during last winter's blizzard, gave them a warm smile. The Cooper children waved shyly from 2 rows ahead. The organ wheezed to life, and the congregation rose for the first hymn. Miriam's clear voice joined with the others, and she felt Michael's deeper tones rumbling beside her. He knew all the old hymns, she realized, though he hadn't sung them in years. When Preacher Davidson took his place behind the pulpit, His kind eyes swept the congregation, lingering for a moment on Michael and Miriam. His sermon text for the day was from the book of Ruth. "Entreat me not to leave thee," he read, "or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." As the preacher spoke of Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, of Boaz's kindness to a stranger in his fields, Miriam felt tears pricking at her eyes. She thought of that day in the dusty street, when Michael had stepped forward to claim her. Like Boaz, he had offered protection when she had nothing. "The Lord works in ways we don't always understand," Preacher Davidson continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "Sometimes family comes to us not through blood, but through the bonds of love and faith. Ruth was a stranger in a strange land, yet through God's grace she found not only a home, but a place in the lineage of our Lord Jesus Christ himself." Michael shifted beside her, and Miriam felt his arm press against hers, warm and solid. She didn't pull away. "In times of trouble," the preacher said, "we must remember that God's family is bigger than our earthly understanding. Sometimes he builds families in unexpected ways, joining hearts and souls through trials and tribulations, creating bonds stronger than any natural kinship." After the final hymn and benediction, Miriam expected Michael to hurry them out, avoiding the social hour that usually followed service. But he surprised her by staying seated, letting others file past. Several people stopped to greet them, offering hesitant but genuine welcomes. When the church had mostly emptied, Preacher Davidson made his way down the aisle to their pew. His wife followed, carrying a covered dish that smelled of fresh-baked cornbread. "Brother Michael," the preacher said warmly, extending his hand, "it does my heart good to see you in God's house again." Michael stood, shaking the offered hand. "Been too long," he admitted quietly. "And Sister Miriam." The preacher turned to her, his eyes kind. "You've been in our prayers." "Thank you," she whispered, touched by his use of the word sister. "Sarah would be pleased," the preacher said softly to Michael, "to see her home filled with life again, to know you're not alone up there anymore." Michael's jaw worked for a moment before he could speak. "Reckon she would at that." "A family is built in love, not just blood," Preacher Davidson said, looking between them. "The Lord knows what he's about, even when we don't understand his ways." Mrs. Davidson stepped forward then, pressing the covered dish into Miriam's hands. "I made extra cornbread," she said with a warm smile. "Would you and Michael join us for supper? Several families are gathering in the churchyard." Miriam looked up at Michael, uncertain, but found him nodding. "Much obliged," he said. Outside, tables had been set up in the shade of the old cottonwood trees. Children played tag between the gravestones while their parents spread out dishes of fried chicken, potato salad, and various pies. The foolish atmosphere was relaxed, informal, so different from the tension of that morning. Miriam found herself seated between Michael and Mrs. Miller, whose friendly chatter soon had her feeling at ease. The cornbread was passed around, along with a hearty stew that Mrs. Peterson had brought. When Michael actually laughed at one of Mr. Cooper's farming jokes, Miriam felt her heart swell with joy. Looking around the table, she saw not judgment, but acceptance beginning to bloom. These people had known Michael for years, had respected his solitude while grieving for his loss. Now they were watching him emerge from that grief, and they seemed genuinely happy for both of them. Even the children had accepted their presence, bringing them wild flowers they'd picked from the churchyard and begging Michael to tell stories about the mountain. He obliged with a tale about a mother bear and her cubs that had the little ones giggling. As the afternoon sun lengthened the shadows, Miriam caught Michael watching her across the remains of their meal. There was something new in his expression, a lightness, as though some of his own shadows had lifted. When she smiled at him, he smiled back, unguarded and real. For the first time since her father had thrown her trunk into the street, Miriam felt truly unashamed. Here, among these good people who had known her since childhood, she could stand tall beside Michael. They weren't judging her by what she couldn't do, but by what she was doing, helping to heal a broken man, making a home where there had been only emptiness. The sun was setting by the time they climbed back into the wagon for the ride home. Several people called out goodbyes, and Mrs. Davidson made them promise to come again next Sunday. As they rolled away from the church, Miriam felt hope stirring in her heart. Real, solid hope for the future. She glanced at Michael's profile, strong against the golden evening light. "Thank you," she said softly, "for today." He clicked to the horses before answering. "Preacher was right about Sarah," he said finally. "She always said a house needs laughter in it. Reckon she'd be glad to know there's some again." Miriam reached over and squeezed his hand where it rested on the reins. He turned his palm up, lacing his fingers with hers, and they rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence as the evening stars began to appear above the mountains. The summer evening settled softly around Michael's cabin. Crickets chirped their evening song, while a cool breeze rustled through the pines. Inside, Miriam hummed quietly as she stirred a pot of beans simmering on the cook stove. The familiar scent of cornbread, left over from the church gathering, mingled with the savory aroma of the beans and bacon. Michael sat in his wooden chair by the hearth, reading from his Bible, something he'd taken to doing more often lately. The lamp cast warm shadows across his weathered face as his lips moved silently over the familiar words. Peace filled the cabin, wrapping around them like a well-worn quilt. Miriam added a pinch of salt to the beans, tasting them carefully. "Supper's almost ready," she said, reaching for 2 tin plates on the shelf. The first hint of trouble came as a strange flicker through the window, like lightning but too close and too orange. Michael looked up sharply, nostrils flaring. "Smoke," he said, rising to his feet. Before either could move, flames erupted against the outer wall, visible through the window. The dry timber of the cabin, seasoned by years of mountain weather, caught quickly. Orange tongues of fire licked up the logs, hungry and fierce. "Miriam!" Michael's voice cracked like a whip as he lunged toward her. Smoke began pouring through the gaps between the logs, thick and choking. The heat built rapidly, making the air shimmer. She stood frozen, the bean pot forgotten in her hands, watching in horror as flames crawled across the ceiling. Michael grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the door. "Out! Now!" They stumbled onto the porch, gasping in the clean night air. The fire roared behind them, consuming the cabin with terrifying speed. Miriam could hear the crackle of burning wood, the sharp pop of sap in the logs. Michael pushed her further from the building. "Stay back!" Then, before she could stop him, he turned and ran back into the inferno. "Michael, no!" Miriam screamed, but her voice was lost in the roar of the flames. Seconds stretched like hours as she waited, heart pounding. The heat pressed against her face even from 20 feet away, and sparks danced up into the darkening sky. Finally, Michael burst through the door, dragging her trunk. His shirt smoldered, and angry red burns marked his arms where falling embers had struck him. He dropped the trunk and stumbled, falling to his knees in the dirt. The crack of splitting timber drew their attention back to the cabin. The roof groaned, sagging inward as support beams gave way. Michael tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't hold him. Miriam knelt beside him, supporting his shoulders as they watched their home collapse in on itself. The sound of approaching horses cut through the chaos. Neighbors from nearby homesteads, having seen the flames against the evening sky, arrived too late to help. Mrs. Miller's husband led the group, already shouting orders to form a bucket line to keep the fire from spreading to the barn. But the cabin itself was beyond saving. As the walls fell inward, sending up a fountain of sparks, Miriam felt tears streaming down her face. All of Michael's possessions, his memories of Sarah, the life he'd built here, all gone in minutes. Michael sagged against her, his breathing ragged. The burns on his arms looked angry and painful in the firelight. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "Your trunk was all I could save." "Hush," she said, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have gone back in at all." She touched his blistered skin gently, making him wince. Mrs. Miller hurried over, with wet cloths. "Land's sake, Michael Grant, what were you thinking?" She helped Miriam wrap his burns, clucking her tongue at the severity of them. "These need proper doctoring." More neighbors arrived, bringing water and blankets. They formed a circle around the burning ruins, ensuring the fire wouldn't spread to the surrounding forest. The night filled with the sound of shouted instructions and the clash of metal buckets. Michael's face had gone gray with pain, his jaw clenched tight. When he tried to stand again, his legs buckled. 2 men caught him before he could fall. "Get him to town," Mrs. Miller ordered. "Dr. Jenkins will still be up. We'll handle things here." As they helped Michael into a wagon, Miriam stood watching the last walls of the cabin collapse. The flames illuminated boot prints in the dirt near the back wall. Proof, if any was needed, that this was no accident. Caleb's threat had become reality, delivered by hired hands in the night. Guilt crushed down on her like a physical weight. She had brought this destruction to Michael's door. Her presence had made him a target for his brother's schemes. Now he was hurt, his home destroyed, all because he had shown kindness to a barren woman cast out by her family. "Come along, dear," Mrs. Miller said gently, taking her arm. "There's nothing more to be done here tonight." Miriam allowed herself to be led to the wagon where Michael lay. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, but he reached for her hand as she climbed in beside him. Even now, even in pain, he sought to comfort her. The wagon jolted into motion, each bump drawing a suppressed groan from Michael. Miriam held his hand, feeling the tremors that ran through his body. The burns on his arms gleamed wetly in the starlight, and the acrid smell of smoke clung to their clothes. Behind them, the glow of the fire lit up the night sky, marking where their home had stood just hours before. The peace of their evening meal seemed like a dream now, shattered by flames and malice. Miriam's tears fell silently as she watched Michael's face contort with pain at each rough patch in the road. "Not your fault," he whispered, though his voice was hoarse from smoke. "Don't you go blaming yourself." But how could she not? Everything she touched seemed to turn to ashes. First her parents' rejection. Now this destruction visited upon the one person who had shown her kindness. The curse of her barrenness seemed to extend beyond her womb, poisoning all hope of home and family. The wagon rolled on through the darkness, carrying them toward town and whatever uncertain future awaited them. Behind them, the last flames of their home flickered and died, leaving only glowing embers where happiness had begun to take root. Mrs. Miller wrapped a blanket around Miriam's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort that fell on deaf ears. All Miriam could think about was Michael's pain, his ruined home, the life they had started to build. All destroyed because of her. The night pressed in around them, full of shadows and fears of what tomorrow might bring. Dr. Jenkins shook his head gravely as he examined Michael's burns. These need constant care. The fever's already starting." He turned to Mrs. Miller, whose barn they'd converted to a makeshift sick room. "He'll need watching day and night." "I'll stay with him," Miriam said firmly, already rolling up her sleeves. The doctor's eyebrows rose, but something in her stance made him hold his tongue. Mrs. Miller laid out clean bandages on a rough wooden table. "You can use our barn long as needed, dear. Them burns need proper tending, and it's safer here than in town with Caleb skulking about." The barn was cool and dim, sweet hay scenting the air. They'd made Michael comfortable on a clean straw pallet, covered with fresh quilts. His face was drawn with pain, skin flushed with rising fever. The angry red burns on his arms glistened with the doctor's salve. "Keep the wounds clean," Dr. Jenkins instructed, packing his bag. "Cool cloths for the fever. This paste needs changing twice daily." He pressed a small jar into Miriam's hands. "Ground willow bark for the pain. Mind you make him drink plenty." Miriam nodded, memorizing every detail. She wouldn't fail Michael now, not after all he'd done for her. The doctor's footsteps faded, leaving her alone with her patient and her fears. Through the long night, she bathed Michael's face as fever gripped him. His skin burned beneath her touch, and his sleep was restless. Sometimes he muttered names she didn't know. Sarah, little James, his lost family haunting his dreams. When dawn painted the barn walls pink, Miriam retrieved her grandmother's hymnal from her trunk, the one Michael had risked his life to save. The leather was worn smooth by generations of hands, pages softened by years of prayer. Her voice was quiet but steady as she began to sing. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The familiar words filled the barn's shadowed corners. Michael's breathing seemed to ease, his face relaxing slightly as she continued. She sang through her favorites, "Rock of Ages," "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," until her throat grew hoarse. "Sarah used to sing," Michael whispered, startling her. His eyes were glazed with fever but focused on her face. "Haven't heard him since." "Rest now," Miriam soothed, laying a fresh, cool cloth on his forehead. "Save your strength." But he caught her wrist with his unburned hand. "You should go. Not safe. Caleb won't stop." "I will not abandon you," Miriam said firmly, gently freeing her hand to adjust his blanket. "Now hush, and let me tend these burns." The days fell into a steady rhythm. Miriam rose before dawn to fetch fresh water from the well, haul it back in heavy buckets that made her arms ache. She ground herbs with Mrs. Miller's mortar and pestle, carefully measuring the willow bark that eased Michael's pain. Twice daily, she cleaned and wrapped his burns, working as gently as she could. The first few days, he couldn't quite suppress his groans when she peeled away the old bandages. She hummed hymns while she worked, trying to distract them both from the task. Mrs. Miller brought food, hearty stews and fresh bread, but Miriam had to coax Michael to eat. The fever sapped his strength, leaving him weak as a newborn colt. She fed him spoonfuls of broth, wiping his face like a child's when he lacked the energy to do it himself. "You don't have to stay," he said again on the third day, his voice stronger but still rough. "I know you didn't ask for any of this." Miriam carefully spread healing paste over his burns before answering. "Neither did you ask for a barren woman to bring trouble to your door, yet you took me in without hesitation." "That was different. Was it?" She began wrapping clean bandages around his arm. "You showed me mercy when others cast me out. You gave me dignity when they tried to shame me. Now it's my turn to care for you." His eyes, clearer now as the fever slowly released its grip, studied her face. "Miriam." "I choose to stay," she said firmly, tucking the bandage end neatly. The way you chose to help me that day in town. Sometimes the Lord works in ways we don't expect." As the days stretched on, color gradually returned to Michael's face. The angry red of his burns began to fade, though Miriam knew the scars would remain. She kept singing, her voice growing stronger with practice. Sometimes Michael would join in on familiar verses, his deep bass complementing her lighter tones. Mrs. Miller brought news from town between her regular checks on them. Caleb had been seen asking questions, trying to find where they'd gone. But the neighbors kept quiet, closing ranks around their own. Even those who had once whispered about Miriam now spoke against Caleb's cruelty. "Burning a man's home," Mrs. Miller clucked her tongue. "That's not Christian behavior, no matter what he claims about contracts and rights." One evening, as Miriam changed Michael's bandages, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Why did you really stay?" he asked quietly. "Truth now." Miriam's hands stilled on the bandages. "Because..." She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "Because you saw worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself. Because you offered protection without demanding anything in return." Her voice grew stronger. "Because here, helping you heal, I know my purpose. Whether I can bear children or not, I can still nurture, I can still care, I can still love." The word hung in the air between them, honest and bare as a newborn thing. Michael's good hand found hers, squeezing gently. "I reckon," he said softly, "that's worth more than any number of babies." Tears pricked Miriam's eyes, but she blinked them back, focusing on finishing her task. Her hands were steady as she tied off the last bandage, though her heart thundered in her chest. That night she sang "It Is Well With My Soul" into the gathering darkness. Michael's voice joined hers on the chorus, growing stronger with each verse. Their harmony filled the barn's shadowed corners with something that felt very much like hope. The summer morning dawned clear and bright as Sarah Miller's children tumbled into the barn, their arms full of wildflowers. "Miss Miriam," little Emma called out, her braids bouncing. "We picked these special." Miriam looked up from where she was organizing clean bandages. "Why, they're beautiful. Shall we put them in water?" Michael, propped up on his pallet, watched with quiet amusement as the children arranged their bouquet in an old mason jar. His burns were healing well, the angry red fading to pink, though the scars would stay with him. "Mama sent soup," Tommy announced, producing a covered pot from his wagon. "She says you're too thin from all your nursing." The barn had become a gathering place of sorts. Every day brought new visitors bearing food, medicine, or simply kind words. Even folks who'd once turned away now stopped to offer help. The change warmed Miriam's heart, though she tried not to show how much it meant to her. "Much obliged," Michael said, his voice stronger now. "Your mama's soup could bring a man back from death's door." The children giggled, then settled cross-legged on the clean straw as Miriam pulled out her grandmother's Bible. This had become their morning routine, reading lessons while Michael rested. The little ones traced letters with careful fingers, while older children practiced harder words. "Teacher says you explain things better than she does," Emma confided, leaning against Miriam's knee. Miriam smoothed the child's hair. "Now then, where were we in the story of Joseph?" The morning light streamed through barn slats as young voices sounded out words. Michael dozed, lulled by their gentle murmur. Outside, more wagons arrived. Men with tools, women with baskets. The community had decided the burned cabin couldn't wait. "Ain't right leaving that mess," Tom Jenkins declared, leading a group towards the ruins. "Time we cleared it away. Make ready for rebuilding." His wife Sarah nodded firmly. "That Caleb Grant can't run decent folks off their land with fire and threats. Not while we have breath to help," The sound of work crews drifted into the barn, splitting wood, hauling stone, clearing debris. Miriam's eyes grew damp as she listened. These were the same people who'd watched her father cast her out months ago. Now they labored in the summer heat to restore what Caleb had destroyed. Around noon, Martha Wilson appeared with fresh bread and news. "Judge Whitaker's coming," she announced, setting down her basket. "Preacher sent word 2 days ago, told him about the burning and such. He'll be here end of week to hear the case." Michael sat up straighter, wincing slightly. "Whitaker's a fair man. Known him since he first rode circuit out here." "That's not all," Martha continued, lowering her voice. "Tom's cousin works at the land office over in Denver. Says some of them contracts Caleb's been waving around don't quite match their records. Papers with dates that don't align right." Miriam's hands stilled on her mending. "You mean he forged them?" "Wouldn't put it past him," Michael growled. "Caleb never did care much for honest dealing." The afternoon brought more visitors. Women stopped by with preserves and advice for treating burns. Children darted in with treasures found while their fathers worked. Pretty stones, interesting feathers, even a tiny bird's nest. Each gift was carefully arranged near Michael's pallet, turning the barn corner into something almost home-like. As evening approached, Rebecca Turner arrived with her 3 youngest. "Thought the little ones might like some schooling," she said meaningfully, "seeing as how good you are with children and all." Miriam understood the gesture for what it was, open acknowledgement that her worth wasn't measured in ability to bear children, but in capacity to nurture. She gathered the children close, helping them sound out simple words from her Bible, while Rebecca watched approvingly. "You've got a way with them," Rebecca observed later, as her sleepy children gathered their things. "Natural as breathing, more than some birth mothers I've known." The words eased something in Miriam's heart that had been clenched tight since that terrible morning when her father cast her out. She blinked back tears as she straightened the children's jackets and smoothed their hair. "God gives different gifts," she said softly. "Took me some time to see that." Michael's voice came from behind her, warm and certain. "Some folks are meant to mother more than just their own. Reckon that's a bigger blessing, in its way." As twilight deepened, the work crews began packing up their tools. Tom Jenkins stopped by to report their progress. "Got most of the burned timber cleared away. Foundation's still solid. Good stonework there. We can start rebuilding proper once the judge settles things." Miriam brought him water while he detailed their plans. The new cabin would be larger, he explained, with proper windows and a root cellar. "Whole town's pitching in. Even got the mill offering lumber at half price." "Why?" Miriam couldn't help asking. "After everything—" Tom's weathered face softened. "Because we were wrong before, letting you be treated that way. And because we've watched you these past months, caring for Michael, teaching our young ones, showing kindness to all, that's worth standing up for." Later, as Miriam trimmed the lamp and settled in for her night watch, Michael caught her hand. "They see you now," he said quietly. "The way I saw you that first day." "What way is that?" "As someone worth protecting, worth fighting for." His grip tightened slightly. "Caleb won't win this time, not with the whole town standing with us." Miriam's free hand found her grandmother's Bible, its familiar leather smooth under her fingers. "I used to pray for God to heal whatever was broken in me," she admitted. "Now I'm starting to think maybe I wasn't broken at all, just meant for a different kind of mothering." Through the barn's open door, they could hear evening settling over the valley, crickets chirping, night birds calling, the soft murmur of the creek. Somewhere in town, a church bell tolled the hour. Here in their temporary sanctuary, surrounded by children's flowers and community's care, Miriam felt peace stealing over her. The lamp flickered, casting gentle shadows as she began her evening routine of checking Michael's bandages. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more helping hands, more steps toward healing and justice. For tonight, it was enough to know they weren't alone anymore. Children's artwork decorated the barn walls now, bright drawings pinned to rough wood. Flowers brightened every corner, their sweet scent mixing with clean hay. What had begun as a sick room had become something else, a gathering place, a schoolroom, a shelter for hope. "Read to me?" Michael asked, settling back on his pallet. Miriam opened her Bible to where a wildflower marked their place. Her voice rose clear and steady in the lamplight, sharing ancient words of comfort with new understanding. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats marked more neighbors arriving with supplies for tomorrow's work. The rebuilding would continue, not just of walls and roof, but of hearts and community. The town hall buzzed with tension as people packed the wooden benches. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Judge Horace Whitaker sat behind a makeshift bench, his stern face weathered by years of frontier justice. His silver hair caught the light as he shuffled through papers, studying each document with careful attention. Miriam sat beside Michael in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. His bandaged arms showed beneath his clean shirt sleeves, the best one he had left after the fire. Around them, townspeople whispered and shifted, their boots scraping against the rough floorboards. Caleb Grant stood near the front, dressed in an expensive coat that seemed out of place in the simple hall. His smile carried the same sharp edge as the fancy watch chain across his vest. Two ranch hands lingered near the door, their eyes darting between their boss and the crowd. "This court will come to order," Judge Whitaker announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We're here to settle matters of property rights and personal protection." He adjusted his spectacles, peering at the assembled crowd. "Mr. Caleb Grant, you may present your case." Caleb stepped forward, all smooth charm and practiced words. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of legal standing. The woman Miriam Callahan has no inheritance rights to her family's property. Her father's written declaration makes that clear." He produced a document with a flourish. "Furthermore, she has no male guardian or proper marriage contract to protect her interests." The judge accepted the paper, studying it carefully. "And your interest in this matter, Mr. Grant?" "Merely concerned with proper order, Your Honor. Can't have unattached women claiming protection without legal standing. Sets a dangerous precedent." Caleb's smile widened. "I have associates who might be willing to offer her a proper arrangement, for suitable consideration, of course." An angry muttering rose from the crowd. Miriam felt Michael tense beside her, his jaw clenching tight. "And what of Michael Grant's claim of protection?" the judge asked, his tone neutral. Caleb waved dismissively. "My brother's a mountain man, Your Honor. Lives alone up in the hills, barely comes to town. No proper home now, thanks to that unfortunate fire. What kind of protection can he offer?" "Seems to me," the judge said slowly, "that the matter of that fire bears examining." He turned to Michael. "Mr. Grant, you may approach." Michael stood carefully, mindful of his healing burns. He walked to the front, his steps steady despite the pain Miriam knew he still carried. "Your Honor," Michael began, his voice rough but clear, "I claim the right to protect Miriam Callahan by virtue of property and honest intention." He reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing a folded paper. "This is my late wife's deed to 160 acres of prime valley land, signed and witnessed 15 years ago." The judge took the document while Caleb's smile faltered. "I'm familiar with this parcel," Whitaker said. "Good water rights, excellent grazing. Never understood why you didn't develop it." "Wasn't ready after losing Sarah and the baby," Michael said simply. "Kept to the high country instead. but the deed's sound and the taxes paid regular. "That deed was promised to me," Caleb burst out, then caught himself as heads turned. "That is, there were discussions." "Were there indeed?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "Interesting that you'd mention it, given this next matter." He shuffled through his papers. "I have here statements from 3 witnesses regarding the fire that destroyed Michael Grant's cabin." Tom Jenkins stood up from his bench. "I'll speak to that, Your Honor. Saw 2 men riding away just as the flames took hold. Recognized them as hands from the Grant Ranch. Caleb's ranch, that is." "Lies," Caleb snarled, but the judge held up his hand. "I also have a sworn statement from Jake Miller, formerly employed by Caleb Grant." The judge adjusted his spectacles. "He testifies that Mr. Grant ordered the cabin burned, saying, and I quote, 'If my brother won't sign over that valley land, we'll smoke him out.'" The hall erupted in angry voices. Caleb's face darkened as he glared at Michael. "You can't prove any of this." "Actually," the judge said calmly, "Mr. Miller provided quite detailed proof, including records of payment and written instructions." He set the papers down with deliberate care. "Most unwise to leave such things lying about, Mr. Grant." Rebecca Turner stood up suddenly. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak about Miriam, if I may." The judge nodded. "Proceed." "We've all watched her these past months," Rebecca said clearly. "Teaching our children, caring for Michael's injuries, showing nothing but grace despite cruel treatment. She's proven her worth 10 times over whatever her father might have declared." More voices joined in, offering testimony about Miriam's character and the community's support. The preacher spoke of her faithful attendance at services. Martha Wilson described how Miriam had helped nurse her sick child. Even the schoolteacher stood to praise Miriam's way with struggling students. Through it all, Miriam sat very still, tears threatening to spill. She had never expected this outpouring of support from people who had once turned away from her shame. "Enough!" Caleb shouted. "This is about law, not sentiment. The woman has no rights except what a man gives her through marriage or guardianship, and my brother's protection means nothing without a proper home or standing." "That's where you're wrong," the judge said quietly. "The law recognizes more than just papers and contracts. It recognizes character, community standing, and right action." He straightened in his chair. "I will review these documents and testimonies. My ruling will come tomorrow morning." The crowd began to disperse, but Caleb wasn't finished. He strode toward Michael, face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? That deed should have been mine years ago. You're nothing but a mountain hermit playing at protector." "That's enough," Judge Whitaker's voice cracked like a whip. "One more word, Mr. Grant, and you'll face charges of witness intimidation along with arson." Caleb stepped back, smoothing his fancy coat. "Tomorrow, then," he said tightly, and stalked out with his men following. Miriam hurried to Michael's side, taking his arm. She could feel him trembling slightly, though whether from pain or anger she wasn't sure. "Let's get you home," she said softly, meaning the barn that had become their temporary shelter. Together they walked out into the bright afternoon. Friends stopped to offer encouragement and support. The preacher promised prayers. Tom Jenkins assured them that work on the new cabin would continue, judges ruling or no. "The whole town's with you," Martha Wilson said firmly. "We won't let Caleb Grant drive good people off their land." Back in the barn's quiet shelter, Miriam helped Michael ease onto his pallet. The day's strain showed in the tight lines around his eyes. She brought him water and began checking his bandages. "Your hands are shaking," he observed softly. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "What if the judge rules against us?" "He won't." Michael caught her hand in his. "Whitaker's known for being fair. He sees what Caleb really is." "I never knew about your wife's land," Miriam said carefully. All that good valley property just waiting. Couldn't face it after Sarah died. Michael's voice roughed. Kept to the high country instead, letting memory fade. Caleb wanted to buy it cheap, but Sarah loved that land. Couldn't let it go to him. Miriam squeezed his hand gently. And now? Now I'm thinking it might be time to build something new, if you're willing. Before Miriam could respond, the barn door creaked open. The preacher stepped in, carrying his Bible. Thought you might want some company while we wait for tomorrow's ruling, he said kindly. Perhaps we could pray together? Miriam reached for her grandmother's Bible, its familiar weight comforting. Outside, they could hear hammers and saws as men continued working on their new home. Children's voices drifted in, reciting lessons she had taught them. She clasped Michael's bandaged hand, feeling his quiet strength. Together they bowed their heads as the preacher began to pray, asking for justice and guidance. Miriam added her own silent prayer, not just for the judge's ruling, but for the future taking shape in her heart, built on faith, community, and love stronger than any legal document. The afternoon light slanted golden through the barn boards as they waited for tomorrow's justice, surrounded by signs of hope and healing. Evening shadows crept through the barn's weathered boards. The last echoes of hammering had faded as the townspeople headed home, leaving Michael and Miriam alone with their thoughts. The lantern cast a soft glow across the hay-strewn floor, barely reaching the rough-hewn rafters above. Michael shifted on his pallet, wincing as the movement pulled at his burned skin. His bandaged hands lay useless in his lap, and Miriam noticed how he stared at them with hollow eyes. The strong mountain man who had once wielded axe and rifle with such skill now struggled to hold a cup steady. "Here," Miriam said softly, bringing him fresh water. "Let me help." "Reckon I'm not much use to anyone now," Michael said, his voice rough with bitterness. He turned his face away as she held the cup to his lips. "Can't even feed myself proper. How can I protect you or provide when I'm barely more than a burden?" Miriam set the cup aside, her heart aching at his despair. She reached for her grandmother's Bible, its leather worn smooth by years of faithful hands. The pages fell open to a familiar passage in Isaiah, marked by a pressed wildflower from their mountain home. "Listen," she said gently, moving closer so the lantern light fell on the words. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine, because you are precious in my eyes, and honored, and I love you." Her voice grew stronger as she read, filling the barn's shadowed corners with ancient promises. "These burns will heal, Michael. Your strength will return. But even if they didn't, even if you never held an axe again, you would not be worthless." Michael's shoulders tensed. "How can you say that? After everything you've suffered, you deserve a man who can offer more than a burned-out cabin and scarred hands." "You offered me dignity when my own father cast me out," Miriam answered, closing the Bible carefully. "You gave me shelter when others turned away. These scars?" She touched his bandaged arm with gentle fingers. "You got them saving what little I had left in this world." The lantern flickered as an evening breeze found its way through the barn walls. Outside, a whippoorwill called softly in the gathering dusk. "I need to tell you something," Michael said after a long moment. He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the dim light. "What I did that day in town, claiming you, it wasn't just charity or duty." Miriam's heart quickened, but she remained still, waiting. "I'd seen you before, at church and market days. Noticed how gentle you were with children, how you carried yourself with grace despite the whispers." His voice grew husky. "When your father left you standing in that street, Something in me couldn't bear to see you broken." He shifted carefully, reaching for her hand with bandaged fingers. "I love you, Miriam Callahan. Not from pity, not from obligation, but by choice. Whatever the judge rules tomorrow, I want you as my wife, if you'll have a battered old mountain man who's finally learning to pray again." Tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks, catching the lantern light like gold. "They said I was worthless without the ability to bear children," she whispered. "That no man would want me." "They were wrong," Michael said firmly. "A family isn't just about bearing children. It's about bearing each other's burdens, sharing faith and hope." He squeezed her hand gently. "You've shown me that?" Miriam looked at their clasped hands, his wrapped in healing bandages, hers small but strong from months of hard work. In that touch, she felt all the quiet moments they had shared. Scripture readings by firelight, shared meals, silent prayers, and growing trust. "Yes," she said softly, then again with more certainty. "Yes, I will be your wife, Michael Grant." The whippoorwill called again as they sat together in the deepening twilight. No grand gestures marked their engagement, no ring or formal words, just the quiet certainty of two hearts finding home in each other's faith and love. Michael lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers. "Whatever comes tomorrow," he murmured, "we'll face it together." Miriam leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of his healing burns. The Bible lay open in her lap, its promises as steady as the mountain peaks that had sheltered them both. In the barn's shadows, their bond was sealed not by legal papers or public ceremony, but by the deeper covenant of chosen love and shared faith. Morning sunlight streamed through the town, Hall's tall windows casting long shadows across the packed room. Judge Whitaker sat at the makeshift bench, his weathered hands folded over a stack of documents. The crowd held its breath as he cleared his throat, his stern gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. Miriam gripped Michael's arm, careful of his healing burns. Caleb stood across the aisle, a smug smile playing at his lips as he adjusted his fine leather vest. "Having reviewed all testimonies and evidence," Judge Whitaker began, his voice filling the hushed room, "I find the following." He lifted a sheet of paper, squinting at it through his wire-rimmed spectacles. "The supposed contracts presented by Caleb Grant regarding Miss Callahan's inheritance are hereby declared void, bearing clear signs of forgery." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Caleb's smile faltered. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the land deed presented by Michael Grant is verified as legitimate, granting him full rights to the northern timber property." He paused, his expression hardening. "As for the matter of arson against Michael Grant's cabin, evidence and witness testimony clearly implicates hired men in Caleb Grant's employ." Caleb's face darkened as the judge fixed him with a stern look. "This court finds Caleb Grant liable for all damages. He is hereby fined $500 to be paid as restitution for the destroyed property and medical expenses." The crowd erupted in whispers. Caleb's face flushed red with humiliation as heads turned toward him, the same townsfolk who had once respected his wealth now viewing him with disdain. "Your Honor," Caleb sputtered, "surely you can't. This court's decision is final," Judge Whitaker declared, bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack. "Justice is served." Michael squeezed Miriam's hand as relief washed over them both. Neighbors pressed forward to offer congratulations, their earlier whispers of judgment transformed into words of support. 3 days later, the little white church glowed in the late afternoon sun. Wildflowers gathered by neighborhood children decorated every windowsill, their sweet fragrance mixing with the lingering scent of pine from fresh-cut boughs. Miriam stood before the mirror in the small back room, smoothing the borrowed wedding dress that 3 neighbor women had altered for her. Though simple, its clean lines and careful stitching spoke of the community's care. Her grandmother's Bible, rescued from the fire, lay wrapped in blue ribbon beside her bouquet of mountain columbine. A soft knock preceded the preacher's wife, her kind face appearing around the door. "It's time, dear." The church had never been so full. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes that danced like golden snow. Michael waited at the altar, standing tall despite his still healing arms, dressed in a clean black suit borrowed from the mercantile owner. As Miriam walked down the aisle alone, she felt the weight of every gaze. But unlike that terrible morning in the street months ago, these eyes held warmth and welcome. The preacher's words rang clear through the wooden sanctuary. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying to the back pews, "we gather to witness not just a marriage, but a testament to God's merciful love." Michael's eyes never left Miriam's face as they exchanged simple gold rings, his bandaged hands gentle as he slipped the band onto her finger. Their voices were steady as they spoke their vows, promises built on months of tested faith and proven devotion. "What God has joined together," the preacher declared, raising his hands over their bowed heads, "let no man put asunder. And may this home you build together stand as a beacon of mercy in our community, showing that family is formed not just by blood, but by love and faith." "Amen," the congregation responded in unison. As Michael kissed his bride, the little church erupted in cheers and applause. Even those who had once whispered cruel judgments now stood, their faces bright with joy and perhaps a touch of shame for their former hardness of heart. Outside, the mountain air carried the scent of pine and promise. Neighbors showered the couple with flower petals and blessings, their congratulations genuine and warm. Children who had learned their letters from Miriam in the barn presented her with hand-drawn cards, while men who had helped clear the burned cabin ruins clapped Michael on the shoulder. The preacher's final words followed them down the church steps. "Go forth in peace, sustained by God's love and this community's support." Michael and Miriam paused at the bottom of the steps, turning to face their neighbors. No longer whispers and judgment, but family forged in faith and adversity. Their joined hands lifted in thanks, their faces glowing with the light of love, proven true through fire and redemption. The new cabin rose proudly against the mountain backdrop, its sturdy logs and wide porch a testament to community spirit. Summer wildflowers dotted the yard, where Michael and Miriam Grant had planted fresh hope along with their kitchen garden. Inside, the main room gleamed with amber lamplight each evening as neighborhood children gathered around Miriam's rocking chair. Her gentle voice guided small fingers across primer pages, teaching letters and numbers. The little ones who had once been shy now crowded close, eager to show her their progress. "Miss Miriam, I wrote my name," little Sarah exclaimed, holding up a slate marked with careful chalk strokes. "So you did, and beautifully too," Miriam praised, her heart full. In his corner by the fire, Michael's knife moved steadily across pine blocks, transforming them into horses and wagons. Wood shavings curled at his feet while children watched in wonder. His scarred hands, now fully healed, worked with careful precision born of love. As dusk painted the sky in purple and gold one evening, Michael and Miriam sat together on their wide porch. The air rang with children's laughter as they played with wooden toys in the yard. 2 little ones chased fireflies, while others sang hymns they had learned at Miriam's knee. Michael's calloused hand found Miriam's, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. In the growing twilight, his voice was soft but sure. "They thought you were cast off," he whispered, watching the children play. "But you were God's gift to me." Miriam's eyes filled with tears of joy as she squeezed his hand. The shame of that long-ago morning in town had faded like morning mist. Here, surrounded by the family they had chosen, she was finally, completely at peace. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.